Hey there, everybody. So it's been a bit. Unfortunately, I caught the flu a while back and totally lost my voice, and then got a cough that still hasn't quite gone away, and a whole bunch of different things have happened all at the same time. Because nothing ever happens on its own. It's just the way of things. So yeah, a whole lot of things are going on. Hopefully, some good will come of some of them. Hopefully some awareness will come of others. Just remember that when everything is falling apart around you, hope is a choice. So, anyway, we're going to be continuing with the Legend of Huma, Chapter 17. Huma's hand hesitated mere inches from the sword. The glow persisted, but there was no repetition of the words. The blade was impressive, the hilt... The blade was impressive, the hilt was brilliantly bejeweled, including one massive green stone that seemed to be the source of the glow. A bell protected the user's hand. The blade itself was as sharp as if newly made. Huma's desire to touch it became almost undeniable. With the sword, he was sure that not even Wormfather could best him. Wormfather. The spell was broken as Huma remembered the dragon. With the sword... No! The knight recoiled from it. He could not say how he knew, but the sword was malevolent. It did not seek his companionship. It sought a slave to do his bidding. As he turned away from the blade, the light reflected off of a polished surface in one corner. Huma scampered over the jewels and coins to get a better look at the object. It was, as he hoped, an elaborate mirror twice his size, the mirror of which Wormfather had spoken. Huma recalled the sightless eye of the cavern dweller and wondered how a blind dragon used a mirror. It was evident that the Wormfather had gathered its treasures over centuries. Mirrors. This was the third. One was owned by the nymph, another hung in the citadel of Magius, all magical. Had they all been made by the same person? He doubted that he would ever know.
Manling, I would speak with you.
Huma started as the voice of Wormfather filled the room. The chamber suddenly was filled with brilliant light, and Huma cursed himself for not realizing his mistake. There were no other entrances to this chamber, because the entrance was the ceiling. Even now the ancient dragon was tugging away this huge slab of rock that served as the lid on his house-sized treasure chest. Huma scanned the endless mounds of booty, seeking something and finding that his eyes always returned to the sinister emerald blade.
Manling,
the Wormfather sniffed, and a great smile lit its terrible face.
The smell of riches is intoxicating, is it not?
Huma was positive that he could cover the distance to the sword in 10 seconds. But would he have that much time?
It is futile to hide, Manling. I can smell you out. I can lay waste to this chamber. Yet, I do not have to kill you. There might be another way.
Huma edged towards the sword. Wormfather's massive head turned at the sound.
A bargain, Knight of Salamnia. A task for me in exchange for one of my treasures. Surely I have gathered a few things your brethren have lost over the years.
Huma remembered the ancient remains wearing the battered crest of a Knight of the Rose. Had Wormfather made the same offer to him? Had he been choosing his prize when the dragon overtook him? Loose coins slid under Huma's foot, and the dragon's head suddenly blocked his path. Huma readied his sword, eyeing with regret the other one so near to him. So close! Wormfather sniffed.
A Salamnic knight, indeed. The game of hide-and-seek is at an end, Manling. Do you accept my offer?
The massive jaws worked into a smile again.
Or shall we see what other arrangement can be made.
What do you want? The Leviathan's ears perked up.
Ah, he does speak. It has been, by my estimate, nearly 300 years since an intruder has dared speak to me directly for reasons other than pleading. Even your voice pleases me after all of this.
I'm glad, Huma said. He could not think of anything else to say. The ensuing chuckle forced him to cover his ears.
A brave one, manling. I like you. What do you say to my offer?
I am willing to hear it.
A truly brave one. Hear me then, manling.
The great beast raised its head high.
I am Wormfather, first and greatest of my dread lady's children. First to rise at her call, I championed her cause against the hideous gods of light and their creeping toadies, and ever emerged triumphant. So great and fearful was my power that at last Kirijolith himself was forced to fight me, and did so with dread, I tell you. We fought for over a year. Mountains were born, brought flat and reborn. The land quaked in our struggles. The seas whipped high. At last I erred, and Kirijolith defeated me. But victory was not enough, though. From the shattered earth he drew this mountain around me, enclosing me from my joyous sky. I would, he said, remain a part of this mountain. Even the slightest breeze would not reach me. Only, he mocked, only one of his own brethren would be able to release me. Only one such as he could set me free.
The blind eyes stared meaningfully at Huma, who was beginning to understand what the dragon was leading to.
For a long time, I believed he meant one of his fellow gods, and I raged and roared. Then I came to understand the trickery in his words. A god was not what he meant. A warrior, straight and true in the path, could do what I could not. And are not the knights of Salamnia the sons of Paladin? Does not that make them brethren in spirit to Kirijolith?
Huma stared at the gleaming sword buried deep in the mound of jewels and coins. In him there was a yearning so strong that he nearly ran to it, but suddenly the terrible visage of Wormfather was again before him. The hot, sulphurous breath stung the knight's eyes.
Free me, knight of Salamnia, and anything here is yours, even the mirror, which served me so well before the darkness came.
The mirror. Huma looked at it. If he could learn its secrets, his own bluster amazed him. How does it work? I might consider it then.
Oh, you must think of a place you wish to go, and then ask. No! Release me first!
The very mountain trembled as the Wormfather went into another berserk rage. The hammering began anew, louder if at all possible. Wormfather raised its massive head and shrieked,
I will not be cheated again!
Huma ran for the sword. The maddened dragon lashed out in anger. The massive jaws opened wide, and the long, draping forked tongue whipped out. Wormfather meant to make a morsel out of the tiny human. Huma's hand closed around the hilt of the sword. It burned in his grip even through his gauntlets. Despite the pain, he pulled the sword free and held it high, moving through sheer reflex and will. Wormfather's jaws closed down on Huma, swallowing countless treasures in the process. For a moment, Huma vanished into the maw of the Titan. With a rock-shattering cry of pain, the ancient Leviathan spasmed. Gold, silver, statuary, jewels, and a badly battered Huma fell from its jaws. The knight hit one of the piles below, sending shockwaves right through his arm. Above, Wormfather shook its head back and forth, trying to dislodge the sword it had forced into its own head. It was a futile effort. The body was already reacting by reflex. The brain of the dragon was dead, the green blade having cut through all barriers protecting it. The dragon's actions only served to drive the blade deeper. Huma rose to his feet just as the massive head began its final descent. Even in death, Wormfather could spell the end of Huma. The knight scrambled. The massive skull struck the ground precipitously close to Huma. The knight, along with nearly a king's ransom in valuables, was flung forwards. His last thoughts of Solamnia, his body struck the mirror, and he landed in the muck and mire of a rain-soaked wasteland. His first frantic thoughts were for the sword. It had remained jammed in the dying dragon's jaws. Huma had to retrieve it. How? He surveyed his surroundings and reeled in shock. This was Solamnia, very near Vingard Keep. Huma sat up and put his face in his hands. He had discovered the secret of the mirror. Now he was transported far from the mountains and his companions. His right arm was numb and nearly useless, but he felt no broken bones. Temporary paralysis would go away after a few hours. Both he and his armor were mud-covered. He felt quickly at his waist, then gave a small sigh of relief. He still had his own sword, puny as it seemed, compared to the wonderful surge of power that he had felt when holding the green blade. Oh, if only. A thought came to him. It was difficult to tell direction, but by the few still recognizable landmarks, he was certain he was south of Vingard Keep. Had it been a brightly lit day, he knew he could have glimpsed the mighty citadel. Ineffectually wiping the mud from his face, Huma started north. The habitations he passed would have provided little protection for a wild animal, much less a human. The wood frames were crumbling with rot. The thatched roofs could barely only be called that. There were too many holes and too little material to patch them with. The mud used to pack the stonework together had become so damp that in many places the walls had fallen completely away. The haunted looks he saw on the faces of the emaciated survivors who peopled this poor excuse for a village sent chills through his body. What, he wondered, was the keep doing about this situation? These people barely existed. Their homes were little more than lean-tos, and some people did not even have that. Instead, they sat in the mire and ravaged earth, and stared at the devastation around them. He knew that the knighthood could not care for them all, but it still agonized him. Huma prayed that somehow he would gain new transportation, so that he could return to the mountain and, if it was allowed, face the challenges once again. He also worried about his two companions. Were they looking for him? Staring at the ruined land, Huma thought that the knighthood might have helped people rebuild their villages, patrol their forests, and possibly gather or grow their own food. Instead, nothing. Huma stopped walking for a moment, thinking about his nearly blasphemous ideas. What would Renard have said if he had heard him? Huma smiled slightly. Probably. Very little, he decided. Several villagers stepped out to gaze at Huma with a variety of expressions: fear, respect, anger, and disgust. 5 men blocked his path. Huma blinked and waited. The 5 men did not step aside. Their apparent leader was a tall, wide man with a foul black beard, a receding hairline, a squashed nose, and more than 200 pounds of what had once been pure muscle. He wore the typical mud-stained pants and much-repaired tunic of a farmer. The clothing was quite insufficient for the harsh weather. The man's beefy hand gripped a smith's hammer. "Throw down your sword, little man, and we'll not hurt you. It's your stuff we want, not you." A thin, pasty-faced lad giggled nervously next to the big man. The boy was nearly bald, and he had all the signs of a plague survivor, including the touch of madness. The remaining 3 were rather nondescript remnants of men, faces and bodies that had wasted away long ago. None of the 5 were true bandits. Huma prayed silently that he would not be forced to raise a hand against them. "Are you deaf?" "I cannot surrender you my valuables or food, if that is what you desire. I have very little." "You have no choice." The big man swung his hammer experimentally in Huma's direction with great precision. "I thinks you're missing the point. We take what we get." The hammer snapped up and into a striking position. Huma's blade was out, yet he was loath to use it, even on them. The choice was taken from him, though, for the brigand leader's hammer came screaming past Huma's face, narrowly missing. 5 forms converged on the single knight, or tried to. Suddenly, Huma's right foot caught an attacker in the stomach. His free hand stunned the giggling lad, who thought to slip under his guard with a rusty old short sword. With the flat of his blade, Huma brought the lad to the ground, unconscious. With ease, he disarmed the watery-eyed old man. Weaponless, that one retreated quickly from the fight, leaving Huma free to take care of the 2 still standing, one of them the apparent leader. Despair suffused Huma as he realized that the last 2 were not about to yield. The one remaining swordsman fought from desperation, which added dangerous strength to his otherwise unremarkable form. The brigand leader smiled viciously as he advanced again and again. With great sadness, Huma made his choice. Before the startled eyes of the other villagers, the Knight of the Crown broke through the swordsman guard and thrust deep into the chest. The man gurgled something and collapsed. Even as his one opponent fell, Huma was beating back the leader with one stinging blow after another. The burly thug began swinging wildly at the knight, and Huma waited. When the opening came, as he knew it would, a single chop put an end to the last of the desperate band. Huma, his breath ragged, looked up at the spectators. They showed no emotion. He could not guess whether they were pleased or angered. He looked around for the 3 survivors. 2 were unconscious, the 3rd had run off. They would be no more trouble. Disgusted, Huma wiped off his sword and sheathed it, and stalked north once more. He was not even out of the village before arguments flared as human vultures fought over the meager belongings of the dead thieves. When he had first stood before Vingard Keep, home of the knighthood, since Venus Solemnis had ordered its construction all those centuries ago, Huma had felt like a mote before the palace of the gods. The feeling lessened only ever so slightly. Vingard Keep's walls rose to a great height. Only a few adversaries dared scale such walls. The walls surrounded the citadel and were punctuated by slits for archers. The only gap in the walls was where the massive iron gates stood guard. They were as thick as Huma's arm was long, and they could stand the full force of a dragon charge. Each of the gates was decorated with the 3-part symbol of the knighthood, the majestic kingfisher with wings half extended, which grasped in its sharp claws a crown on which a rose was centered above its head. A sword on which a rose was centered. Above its head was a crown. After a long, wet wait, a sentry came in response to Huma's hoarse shouts. "Horse! Horse!" He peered down at the bedraggled figure clad in a mixture of Solamnic and Argothian armor and shouted, "Who goes there? State your name and mission!" Huma removed his helmet. "I am Huma, Knight of the Order of the Crown, returned from the lands far beyond. I must speak to Lord Oswald or even the Grand Master himself. It is urgent." "The Grand Master?" Huma could not see the man's face well, but the surprise in his tone was obvious. "Wait!" Huma wondered at the strange reaction. At last the gates began to swing slowly open. The same sentry who had questioned him stood by the gate. At the guard's signal, Huma followed him into the keep. Those knights who had opened the gate wore expressions matching that of Huma's guide. The mystery deepened. The sentry, a young knight of the crown, pulled Huma over to a dark corner and out of the drizzle that had developed. "I know who you are, for Master Renard speaks highly of you in training. So, I have taken this chance to warn you before you make a slip." "Warn me? About what?" "Only this morning," the other knight looked around, "the Grand Master, Lord Trake, passed away, a victim of some foul wasting disease." "No!" Huma nearly shouted. The Grand Master dead? Trake had never cared for Huma, in fact, despised him as did his son Bennett. But Huma could not help feeling the grief, as would all his fellows, at the death of the head of the knighthood. "I did not know. The people in the village seemed uneasy, but they do not know," the other knight hissed. Lord Oswald has decreed that no word shall pass from the keep until a new Grand Master has been chosen. If word should leak out that we are in such disarray, our last defenses will crumble. Last defenses? Tell me, Garvin. Tell me, Garvin, what happened when the darkness overcame our lines? Where do we stand now? Huma clutched at the arms of the other knight. Didn't you come through it? Garvin eyed Huma curiously. The front is no more than 2 days' ride, either east or west. The warlord's black guard moves untouched through the south. Most of our outposts are cut off. We are cut off. Is there no hope? Garvin stiffened. We are Knights of Salamia, Huma. Huma nodded, knowing that they would fight to the end regardless. His mind turned to the cavern, the challenges, and mostly to the sword. He yearned for it now. In his hand, it would cleave through the Queen's evil forces. Salamnia would be victorious. Huma might even carve for himself some tiny kingdom, and he shook his head violently, and Garvin frowned in puzzlement. Huma forced the ungodly thoughts from his mind. The sword was not Paladin's legacy to the knighthood. For all its majesty and power, something about it sickened Huma even as he yearned for it. Not that it mattered. He'd lost everything when he had fallen through the mirror. It was hopeless. No! He straightened and gave Garvin an apologetic smile for his odd actions. There was still time if he could make someone listen. Garvin, where might I find Lord Oswald? What now? The other knight stared at the darkened sky from the shelter. It is past supper, I know that. He would be in his quarters. He's preparing for the nightly council tomorrow night. They're going to wait until tomorrow night before choosing a new Grand Master? The Queen's servants could be at our gates tonight, the dragons at the very least. Garvin nodded. So Lord Oswald said, but the council will be the council. I must speak to him now, then. Huma hurried out into the rain. It had never really rained like this since the war's beginning, Lord Oswald decided. In the past, it had always been nothing more than a mist. Now, it was almost as if the rain could wash it all away. The High Warrior started from his daydreaming. He was becoming senile, he decided, to be thinking of rain when the fate of the knighthood and the world might rest on on getting the dunderheads of the council to speed up their decision on who would be Grand Master. He had ruined his own chances by admitting to his indecision at the rout. It had been only a momentary lapse, a shock at the sudden turn in events, and the realization that they could not fight in this attack. The losses had been costly. Oswald's nephew Bennett was maneuvering his own faction. He always remained within the bounds of the oath and the measure, but he was ambitious and would try to manipulate the decision. Logically, one of the three heads of the orders should be the late Grand Master's successor, but Bennett believed that he should follow his father. Trake had always desired that. Only Oswald stood in his way now. Lord Oswald. He looked up to see Renard watching him intently. The pale knight stood next to the only other chair in Oswald's room. Renard, despite his cold exterior, the High Warrior had almost as much regard for Renard as he did for Huma. Only Huma had been lost in the debacle. Huma apparently had stood fast in the end. What is it, Renard? You've still not formulated your plans. I think it might be wise. There was a commotion outside as the two guards stationed at his chamber doors argued with someone. The newcomer was insistent, and there was something familiar about his voice. Renard, is that... The pale knight had opened the door and, the elder knight could scarcely believe it, now gaped open-mouthed at a bedraggled knight struggling with the two guards. It took only seconds for Lord Oswald to recognize the newcomer, and then he, too, was staring in surprise and delight. Huma! The sentries immediately stopped struggling as they noted the tone of their superior. Renard recovered also, and typically simply said, Let him by. Released, Huma burst into the room. My Lord Oswald! Renard! At attention, Huma! The gaunt knight interrupted. Huma immediately stiffened. Renard turned to the High Warrior, who nodded. To the guards, Renard said, Resume your posts. That is the High Warrior's orders. Once the door was closed, Lord Oswald stared at the trembling knight. Huma had something to say and wanted to say it before he burst before it burst from his head, it seemed. At ease, Huma. Come and sit down. Tell us about the miracle that allows you to return from the dead. Huma knelt before the Elder Knight. Relieved at last, the story spilled from him in a torrent. Lord Oswald and Renard listened intently as each part of Huma's tale unfolded. The quest of Magius, the chase of the Blackguard, the ever-present Dreadwolves, the mountains, the cavern, the dragon, the sword. Had it not been Huma who spoke, neither of the knights would have believed a word. As it was, they truly believed. The great clang of metal upon metal, so much like the sounds of the keep's own forge, interested Lord Oswald the most. He asked Huma his opinion of the noise.
Opal has found a piece of paper to eat.
Ow. Oh, that hurts. A workplace of the gods. There is no other way to describe it. If it is not Reorx who shapes the metal somewhere within that mountain, I can add nothing more, save that I feel I must go back, Huma said, adding, if Paladin wills it. Well, was all the High Warrior could say at first. Renard simply nodded. Lord Oswald thought for a moment. This sword sounds fascinating. Could it? Huma interjected immediately. I fear it is lost to us. Wormfather acts as its tomb. His tone was cautious. He wanted them to forget the sword, not only because of his wariness of it, but because of the temptation Huma felt to grip the blade and to wield it. The High Warrior took his words at face value. I'll trust your judgment. He looked from Huma to Renard and then back again. It seems to me that we cannot let this matter sit for very long. Time is running out for all of us. Nervous enthusiasm in control, Huma quickly spoke. I need only transportation. A horse. Are there dragons about? One of them, maybe. The High Warrior frowned. There's nothing I can do for you anyway, Huma. Not at present. If I send you off on some wild quest, I lose the chance of keeping the knighthood from the hands of those more interested in power and esteem than the oath and the measure. You will have to wait until a new Grand Master is chosen. Huma looked perplexed. But surely I, have been found wanting. It may be another. But Huma could not believe his mission was to be delayed, possibly denied, for such a petty reason. I believe that I can win my case, Huma. I'm sorry, but you will have to wait. Renard, he is one of yours. See to it that he is cleaned up, fed, and allowed to sleep. I'll want to see a clearer head on his shoulders come tomorrow. Yes, my lord. Renard put a friendly but firm hand on Huma's shoulders. The younger knight stood up reluctantly. They parted silently. Huma's depression deepened. Not only was his quest threatened, but so was the life of a man who had been the closest thing to a father that he'd ever had. No one but Lord Oswald could lead knights in this time. Bennett, for all his prowess, lacked experience. Even Huma knew that. The Knights of Solamnia needed strong leadership that only Lord Oswald could provide, Huma believed. Without Oswald, the knighthood would splinter. Without the High Warrior in command, Huma suddenly realized he could never return to the mountain.
You're not going on the balcony. You can sit on the chair, but you're not going on the balcony. It is cold, and you are going to make me uncomfy. You are going to make my hands all sad and freezy. This dog knows no pity of her poor, old, dear, and doddering father. I love you. You can sit on your chair.
Chapter 18. The rain did not let up that night. Exhausted as he was, Huma could not sleep. Like Lord Oswald, he saw some significance in the sudden change from perpetual cloud cover to the incessant rain that so affected nerves as time passed. He heard horses trotting past. Even in the dead of night, there was always activity. Some men slept, others worked. Vingard Keep would never be caught off guard. A returning patrol, he decided. The sounds dwindled off in the direction of the stables. Huma wondered what news, if any, they would bring. Had the lines backed up even further? Would the knights soon be able to view the front from the keep itself? How long before the pincer finally closed upon the cradle of the knighthood? Huma stood up slowly, so as not to disturb those around him in the common quarters shared by the Knights of the Crown. The building was essentially one great room with row upon row of hard, flat beds and small storage areas for each occupant. As the knights slept in shifts, the room was never full. Also, many were away from the keep for one reason or another. Only the higher-ranking knights had quarters of their own. A breath of fresh air, he decided, would do him good. With careful steps, he maneuvered round his fellows and eventually made his way to the door. The air was cool, and the wind was a little more brisk than he had imagined. He breathed in deeply, thankful for the moment when he could briefly relax from all of the sorrows and confusion. Huma prayed that all would go well tomorrow. He blinked. His eyes began to play tricks on him, and he was sure for a brief moment that a dark figure had moved near Lord Oswald's chambers, just behind the two guards. He considered alerting someone, but neither guard seemed disturbed, and when he looked again, there was no sign of the supposed intruder. Huma had no desire to bring ridicule upon himself. Not now. He stared out into the night and, after a few minutes, retired. Sleep came more swiftly this time. The next day passed far too quickly. It had been Huma's intention to steer clear of the other knights, at least, until the question of leadership was resolved. Too much had happened to him, and he did not trust himself to remain neutral on the subject. What he said he knew would be a reflection upon Lord Oswald, who had always stood by him. Even Renard might be affected. Yet, Lord Oswald summoned Huma just 2 hours before the nightly council was to meet. The Knight of the Rose, who brought the message, eyed Huma with great curiosity, but, loyal as he was to the High Warrior, he asked no questions. As Huma was crossing to Lord Oswald's quarters, he was confronted by the very figure he had intended to avoid. "They told me you were alive. I had my doubts, though, until I just saw you now." Bennett was clad in formal attire, including a purple cloak, bearing the standard of both the knighthood and his family's personal holdings. A black sash ran diagonally across his breastplate. Even now, with the rain still lightly falling and the true night almost upon them, he seemed to gleam. Regardless of all else, Bennett was his father's son. The hawk-like features were a copy of the elder knight. "My apologies, Lord Bennett." The family holdings had been ruled equally by Lord Oswald and Trake until the latter's rise to Grand Master. Now, as Trake's heir, Bennett held that title with his uncle. As Oswald had no heirs of his own, the holding would someday be under the rule of only one man. "I had meant to offer my sympathy sooner." "Do not play me for a fool, goat-herder," Bennett rejoined. "You have stayed away from me because we have ever been enemies. I still do not believe that you belong among us, but my own good heart has made your ouster all but impossible. All but impossible now. Little did I know when I praised you posthumously, I thought, that you would return." Huma's entire body felt taut, but he would not allow himself to be provoked by Bennett. He was sure much of the anger in the son of the great Grand Master was due to his father's untimely death. "I have never been your enemy, my lord. Rather, I have always admired you, despite your protest over my selection." Bennett's face actually evidenced mild surprise as Huma spoke. "Your bearing, your skill, your ability to command under the most adverse conditions. You are what I strive to be, and what I may never be. I only ask for the opportunity to do my duty." Bennett's mouth clamped shut. He stared at Huma briefly, and then muttered, "Perhaps." "Perhaps?" Huma raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" The newest Lord of Baxter, though, had already turned away. All Huma could do was watch him vanish into the midst of the keep. Huma proceeded to meet with Lord Oswald. Renard was there. Huma interrupted them as they inspected a map. Lord Oswald was pointing to a spot near the north. They looked up as Huma was admitted, and the High Warrior smiled thinly. Renard merely nodded. Lord Oswald rolled up the map. Were you away from the Crown's general quarters? No, I had the misfortune of confronting your nephew, my lord. The elder knight shook his head. He was looking much more drained than he had the night before. Yes, pay him no mind, Huma. He is unsettled by the fact that you seemingly come back from the dead. He still hates what I am. Then he is a fool, Renard suddenly interjected. You have proven to be 10 times the knight that he is. I thank you, though I do not believe that. Then you are also a fool. Lord Oswald interrupted. The last thing we need to do is to fight among ourselves. The High Warrior put a hand on his forehead, nearly knocking over a lit candle in the process. Huma reached for him, but Oswald waved him away. I'm fine. I didn't get much sleep last night, though. Bad night for insomnia, I should think. Will you be able to go through with the council meeting? Sorry. Okay. Story time is almost over, sweetheart. I need to read 8 more pages. 7 more pages. I know, I'm so mean. 7 more pages, and then we go to bed. Okay? 7 more pages. See? I'm reading bedtime story. 7 more pages, and then we go to bed, okay? I love you. I love you. You're a good girl. You're my good girl. I love you very much. You're a good girl. You make me happy. I love you. Such a good bopper. Yeah, you're a cutie. Well, I told you, 7 more pages and then we go to bed, okay? I need you to see this face. 7 more pages and then we go to bed. I also accidentally showed you a dirty corner of my apartment because I've donated some of the recycling to Opal so that she can chew on it. Will you be able to go through with the council meeting? Asked Renard. What choice have I? Perhaps it's only my personal opinion, but if my nephew, who I must point out thinks he is doing what is best, has any control over the next Grand Master, we will be plunged into disaster. The intensity of the High Warrior's opinion of his nephew surprised Huma. He had known that they did not get along, but this? Why so? Bennett, like many of us, is too caught up in the legends of the knighthood. He is the kind of leader who will have every able knight in Vanguard Keep attacking in one massive heroic charge that will end in the death of all. Would he? Huma's tone was doubtful. Even against the darkness, Bennett appeared calculating and in full command of his senses. He would. You never see Bennett in command of a meeting. He is one for lightning strikes or waves of destruction, never solid long-term strategies. Since Trake's death, I think he is even more determined to do something momentous, to honor his father's memory. Huma may have trouble believing that, but I have known Bennett longer. I would concur, added Renard. Lord Oswald looked up at Huma. Another thing. He would never believe your story of enchanted swords, imprisoned dragons, and God-created challenges that hold the key to victory. I do. Call it faith in Paladin, but I do. The elder knight leaned forward suddenly, holding a hand against his head. Rest. I need some rest, muttered Oswald. Help me with him, Huma. Together the 2 knights led the High Warrior to his bed. As they helped him lie down, Lord Oswald took hold of Renard. You must see to it that I am awake in time for the council. Is that understood? The pale face turned towards Huma, and then back to the High Warrior. With the same lack of emotion he always displayed, Renard said, "Of course. You know I will." "Good." Lord Oswald was asleep almost immediately after that. The two knights stepped away quietly. When they were backed up by the door, Renard turned to Huma. "He wants you at the council meeting." "What about him?" Huma feared for Oswald's health. "He'll be there. I've promised to take care of him." Renard actually smiled slightly. "I have everything in hand. You'll see." Huma made sure that he was one of the first to arrive. Not all knightly councils were open to the population of the keep. Most consisted only of the ruling knights and any persons involved with some portion of the agenda. There was also a set pattern to events, steps that were followed under normal circumstances. It was the feeling of the ruling body, though, that selecting a replacement for the Grand Master was something all should be involved with, and, while not everyone could fit into the chamber, the knighthood as a whole would be well represented. The masters of the Orders of the Crown and the Sword were already seated. Arak Hawkeye tugged at his tiny goatee and stared rather arrogantly at his counterpart of the Sword. Huma did not recognize the man next to Lord Hawkeye. It was not the same knight who had commanded the Order of the Sword these past 4 years. The former commander had died in the war to the east, and his replacement had been chosen on the battlefield out of necessity. The knight's angular face reminded Huma of an idealized statue more than a man. His mustache was long and trimmed narrow, his eyes nearly invisible under a thick, shaggy brow. When Bennett entered, it was clear who was the true ruling power of the Order of the Sword, for the other stiffened. Eventually, the chamber was filled and the waiting began. Only 2 people of consequence were missing, Renard and Lord Oswald. The knightly council waited patiently, members constantly referring with one another during that time. At last, Bennett stalked imperiously over to Lord Hawkeye and spoke sharply in an undertone. Hawkeye responded in kind, and the argument raged for several minutes. Regrettably, they were not speaking loud enough to be understood, and Huma could only guess what might have passed between them. Just then, Renard rushed in, out of breath. There was intense strain on his face, and the image of the normally placid knight in such a high emotional state was enough to cause more than one person to rise in expectation of bad news. Renard whispered quickly to Lord Hawkeye. Bennett and the other councillors listened in as best they could. Bennett's face turned white, and he gripped the nearest chair tightly. Arak Hawkeye stood up to face the suddenly anxious crowd. "This meeting is postponed until further notice. I regret to inform those assembled that Lord Oswald of Baxter, High Warrior and Master of the Order of the Rose, has been stricken ill by the same disease that claimed the Grand Master. A quarantine has been imposed on the keep. Lord Oswald is not expected to live through the night." Baby. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's 5 pages. You can... I know! You can wait 5 whole pages. You can wait 5 whole pages. I love you. You're a good girl. Yes, you are also an impatient girl. There is no patience in this puppy. Come here. I can pet you and read at the same. I'm not going to pet just yet. It's 5 whole pages. You can wait. I love you. I love you, my little cutie. Yeah, I know. Renard was still shaking. I came to wake him as he requested and found him unconscious and shivering in his bed, despite being covered by 2 or 3 blankets. I administered what aid I knew and then fetched a cleric. Huma had never seen him in such a state. It was almost as if the Pale Knight was reliving his own brush with the plague. What did the cleric do? Little. The disease baffles him. Another gift from the Queen, I suppose. Damn her existence. Is there nothing that can be done? Huma suddenly felt weak. Lord Oswald was his mentor, his friend, and the closest thing to a father. He must not die. We can only wait and pray. Was there a hint of bitter mockery in Renard's voice? Huma could not really blame him. He himself felt so powerless. The Dragon Queen, Crinus, and the renegade mage Gallandrakos must be laughing at their fate, he supposed. Huma. Renard laid a hand on his shoulder. The pale face was still strained. How much Renard had cared for Oswald. Go get some sleep. They were in the outer chamber of the keep's temple of Paladin, where High Warrior had been carried in the hopes that the gods might influence Lord Oswald's recovery. At present, the clerics treating the Elder Knight were in a quandary. One moment they would believe that they had beaten the disease, the next moment it would come back, stronger than before. Time was running out. Lord Oswald's body could not stand many more severe swings in health. Renard smiled faintly. I promise you, I will alert you should there be any change. Despite his good intentions, Huma suddenly felt very sleepy, almost as if the mere mention of it had made him recognize that fact. He nodded to Renard and stood up. You will wake me. I promised Lord Oswald that, Renard replied bitterly. As Huma departed, he could still hear Bennett's voice coming from the side chamber where the clerics conferred. Bennett seemed to care for his uncle almost as much as he cared for his father. At the news of the High Warrior's sickness, it had been Bennett's voice that had prevented the panic and organized the temporary quarantine and the shifting of the ailing noble to the temple. Now the Knight of the Sword divided his time between praying for his uncle and arguing with the clerics, whom he thought were reacting too slowly to the crisis. What of the war? It was as if forgotten by those who cloistered themselves within the walls of the keep. The thought nagged Huma all the way to his cot. He woke abruptly, his mind startlingly clear. Lord Oswald was his first thought, and Huma immediately assumed the worst. Others slept on, far more used to the daily loss of precious life, it seemed to him. Huma slipped out into the night and peered round. In the dim torchlight he could make out sentries keeping vigilant watch on the walls, while others patrolled the courtyard. Guards still stood before the doorway leading to the High Warrior's abode. That was a good sign. Unable to sleep, Huma decided to return to the temple. That Renard had not come to him did not surprise him. The Pale Knight evidently meant to keep vigil through the entire crisis if at all possible. The rain had not let up, and the courtyard was turning into a bowl of muck. The Temple of Paladin seemed oddly dark as he neared it. No one stood guard, which did not surprise him, but, as he made his way up the steps and was about to knock upon the temple doors, he noticed that one was slightly ajar. Pushing it open, he discovered the main corridor also dark. That, he knew, was not as it should be. Here there should have been a sentry or at least a cleric. Suddenly Huma found himself before one of the Knights of the Rose, whose duty it was to act as honor guard and, for this crisis, guardian for the ill High Warrior. The knight stood at the doorway looking quite stern, and Huma almost hailed him, till he realized that the man would not be standing in darkness unless there was a very good reason. Stepping cautiously, Huma made his way across the marble floor, and did not stop until he was face to face with the guard. The Knight of the Rose stared back, but did not see. Huma held a hand before the other's face. He could feel and hear the man's breathing, but it was the breathing of one deep in sleep. Huma dared slap the knight lightly on the cheek, and the guard did not stir. Leaning closer, Huma inspected the open eyes. They were glazed. He'd seen men like this before, men who had been drugged for one reason or another. Huma suspected the Knight of the Rose would remember nothing about his lapse of duty. He also suspected that something similar had happened to the rest of the temple's inhabitants, including Renard. With a prayer to Paladin, Huma drew his sword. He followed the darkened halls until he came to a place where Renard had sat, only to discover that the gaunt knight was gone. The doorway to the room where Lord Oswald lay resting was also partially open, and Huma discovered two more guards in the same comatose condition. Huma feared the worst. Renard and Lord Oswald had both been overwhelmed, he decided quickly. With measured step, Huma slowly opened the door to Lord Oswald's chamber. The darkness disoriented him for only a second, and then his trained senses located the even darker blur. Lord Oswald standing by the makeshift bed. Standing? Huma blinked and allowed his eyes to adjust. No, it was not the High Warrior. Oswald was indeed lying on the bed. What then, a shadow? Huma stepped forward and the darkness seemed to shift. He blinked. The figure, or what he had thought was a figure, was no longer there. With some trepidation, Huma moved forward until he was standing next to the still form of Lord Oswald. He was relieved to hear the regular breathing of the High Warrior. Huma's foot bumped against something. He peered down and found himself staring at the inert body of one of the clerics. The cleric slept as the guards had slept, his eyes glazed and wide. Huma shook him hard in an attempt to wake him, but the man did not even stir. He felt, rather than heard, the darkness stir behind him. He hesitated, and that hesitation may have nearly cost him his own life, for something metallic struck his breastplate and would have cut deep into his throat if he had moved any slower. Cursing himself, Huma parried another vicious jab by a tiny, twisted blade. He had his first glance at his attacker, a figure in flowing darkness from which two red, glaring eyes peered. The figure threw the blade at his head, forcing Huma to duck. Even as Huma dodged the weapon, the spectre brought forth a small pouch and raised it. The knight scuttled back quickly. There was no denying what he faced now. The actions, the appearance. He was surprised that he had not recognized the intruder immediately. Were those of a cultist of Morgion, lord of disease and decay, one of the vermin that had made his way into Vingard Keep, and had so far succeeded in killing one, and possibly two, of the most important figures in the knighthood. The ragged figure hesitated before throwing the contents of the pouch. Huma leapt forward, his broadsword up and before him. The flat of the blade slammed into the pouch, which burst, but not before the sword's momentum pushed much of it back at the hooded intruder. Huma stumbled back, avoiding the deadly shower that rained on the other. The assassin coughed and hacked as dust flew into his face. He stumbled back, but Huma dared not step forward. The cultist fell down towards a pew and then, slowly, pulled himself back up again. "If you think," the voice was rough and strained but familiar, "to kill me with my own tools, know that Morgion protects his own. Besides, I only wish to put you to sleep. Now, you leave me no choice." It was all Huma could do to keep from dropping his sword as the hooded figure's throat cleared itself of dust, and his identity was revealed. Huma took a desperate step back, even as the cultist pulled out a broadsword hidden in his robe. The knife point would have nicked you, and again you would have slept. I fear, though, that this is all I have left now. The blade came up, its point directed at Huma's neck. Huma could not bring himself to fight. It could not be happening like this. It could not be true. This was some terrible nightmare from which he could awaken. The assassin laughed quietly. The sword lowered slightly. The laugh seemed to echo through Huma's mind, mocking everything he had ever believed in. "I had tried to protect you from this. I am sorry, Huma." And though Huma could not speak the words at first, they pounded in his head and cried in his heart. Why, Renard? And once again, I get to leave you on a cliffhanger. Wah! Oof. So. Oh, I did something to wonk my shoulder, and I think it was that I had to yank Opal while we were on a walk, and it really did a number on my left shoulder. And the coughing is not helping. Anyway. Like I said before, when everything is going wrong and all is just falling apart around you, hope is a choice. So do your best. It's difficult times ahead, but you can be brave. I have every faith in you. So, in the meantime, get some rest and do your best to become somebody that you can be proud of. And if people can hate without knowing a thing about you, then I can love you for exactly the same reason. Sleep well and take good care of yourself. Good night, dear.